But I mean, I certainly do spend a lot of time in the race with my battery-operated handpiece, dagging lambs and ewes and stuff, and I just listen to my 80s playlist and think about the good old days. Fantastic.
10 days of silence sounds like utter bliss, though, and I totally get it, like the fast-paced life. It's putting your phone away and having some time just for you sounds amazing.
Jamie, thank you for that. Kia ora. And to Zoe, George and Jeremy Rocks, you have both, seriously, you've both been fantastic this afternoon, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's been fun, Jeremy.
Lovely to meet you, Zoe.
Lovely to meet you.
or however you identify yourself.
All right. Oh, that's enough. See you later, both. Bye. I'm back tomorrow.
Bye.
Whakarongo mai koe ke te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, details of New Zealand's first 3-day mass COVID vaccination event for a select group of tertiary students in whānau. Pfizer confirms delivery of another 1.5 million doses of vaccine by the end of August. The lockdown in New South Wales is extended by another fortnight, and is Victoria in trouble too, with 7 new community cases today. Cleaning House, a now defunct company that got millions of taxpayer dollars to house the homeless, apparently had no contract, wasn't quality checked, and owes thousands in tax and wage subsidies. Nurses feel the burn with overloaded counselling services and a complimentary dose of cuteness. The first baby Beaver born in the UK in 400 years.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata with DNA. The government is hoping to vaccinate up to 15,000 people in its first mass vaccination event at the end of the month. Auckland's 3 DHBs are coordinating the 3-day event from Friday, July the 30th at the Vodafone Event Centre in Manukau, South Auckland. The COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins says it will mean some people in Group 4 will get their vaccine ahead of the rollout for their general age cohort.
We're asking these people for their help in encouraging older and more at-risk members of their whānau to get the vaccine so that their community can be more protected from COVID-19.
And the government has confirmed Pfizer will deliver more than 1.5 million doses of its COVID-19 vaccine in August. Chris Hipkins says the delivery schedule for August aligns with the ramp-up phase of the vaccine rollout. More than 1.4 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine have now been administered, and 564,000 people have received both their doses. People in Sydney will remain in lockdown until the end of the month as Greater Sydney remains in the grip of the new Delta variant. New South Wales has reported 97 new local cases of COVID-19, 24 of whom were infectious while in the community. New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian says the numbers are still too high.
And it always hurts to say this, but we need to extend the lockdown at least a further 2 weeks, from Friday the 16th of July to Friday the 30th.
Queues for COVID-19 tests in one of the hotspots in Sydney's southwest stretched for kilometres overnight. Counselling services at some DHBs appear to be struggling to cope with demand from burnt-out staff. Nurses say they're being told to talk to their colleagues instead due to wait times for employee assistance programs. New Zealand Nurses Organisation Kai Whakahaere, Kiri Nuku, says the issue is on her radar.
So it's no surprise, and I've heard it more often recently. It's got a lot of tension inside the health sector, and a lot of these nurses are taking the problems home.
The Health Minister Andrew Little says he isn't aware of problems accessing staff counselling services, but is cognizant of continued staff shortages, which he says the government is working to resolve. You can hear more on this story on Checkpoint shortly. The Reserve Bank has left interest rates unchanged, but taken a significant step towards future rises. It's held the official cash rate at a record low 0.25%, but halted its bond buying program. Here's business editor Giles Beckford.
The Reserve Bank has clearly changed tack, and its next move will be to start a series of gradual rises in the cash rate. It's bought $56 billion worth of government bonds over the past 15 months to keep a lid on interest rates and keep plenty of money in the economy. It says the economy is strong, but faces headwinds and COVID threats. The bank expects inflation spikes will be temporary, and it still needs loose policies to meet its 2% target and support the labour market. Even so, At least one rate rise before the end of the year now looks likely.
An Auckland company, which received nearly $15 million to house homeless families in private rentals, has now also been told to pay back its COVID wage subsidy. Silver Fern Property Services was placed into liquidation in May, and landlords and Inland Revenue are among those owed money. The Ministry for Social Development has also requested $53,000 in wage subsidies be repaid. Social worker Alistair Russell says despite the millions handed out to Silver Fern for emergency accommodation, no one was checking on the business.
Who within the ministry actually thought this was a good idea at the beginning? What is their accountability? That they should be seriously considering their future employment.
The Auditor-General is investigating the use of private rentals for emergency accommodation. As many as 1,000 Inland Revenue staff have been sent home after it was found their central Wellington office tower may not be safe in an earthquake. When looking to renew the lease at the Asterin building on Featherston Street, the IRD received a poorer seismic assessment than previously issued. Staff are to work from home until the building can be strengthened. Inland Revenue says no decision had been made on whether it will now renew the lease. It's 5:04 The Silver Ferns will defend their Constellation Cup title against the Australian Diamonds in October. Netball New Zealand has confirmed the two countries will play 4 tests split between New Zealand and Australia over 11 days. Felicity Reid has more.
The Silver Ferns and Diamonds rivalry resumes with the New Zealand netballers' first trip across the Tasman since 2019, with the first test in Brisbane on October 13th, followed by Game 2 in Cairns 4 days later. The series then moves to New Zealand for games in Auckland and Wellington. The Silver Ferns ended a 9-year Constellation Cup drought earlier this year when they beat the Diamonds 3-1. A New Zealand squad to prepare for the series will be named next month.
The Warriors are packing up and leaving their home away from home today to relocate to a Queensland hub. They're being forced to move from their Central Coast base as a result of the COVID outbreak sweeping nearby Sydney. Warriors back rower Josh Curran is packing up his belongings just a few days after coming out of a fortnight of isolation.
Yeah, it's a bit frustrating, but it's the way it is. Like, we're all settled down in Terrible, but it's another adventure, I guess. It's just the way the world is at the moment, and we're all looking forward to it, and we're all happy to go up there now.
The Warriors play the Penrith Panthers on Sunday. The US men's basketball team have bounced back from shock back-to-back defeats to Nigeria and Australia in the lead-up to the Olympics with a 108-80 win over Argentina. That's the news.
What are we burning?
Not only are we burning more coal, it's the dirtiest coal, and it comes from Indonesia where the mining is appalling.
National says no to cancel culture.
People are feeling right now that they can't say what they think about anything, otherwise they're going to get shut down. We can see people being cancelled, in fact.
And the rural sector strikes back.
They only seem to have 4 sports in New Zealand at the moment. That's rugby, cricket, netball and bashing farmers.
Calm the Farm Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
Now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Waikato, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty. Also Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Mainly fine, but the odd shower near the west coast. Waitomotu, Kapiti, including central high country. Cloudy periods, a few showers developing tonight. Wairarapa, Wellington, Marlborough and Nelson, fine tonight. Scattered rain developing tomorrow afternoon or evening. Canterbury, fine tonight. Rain about the Alps tomorrow. Scattered falls elsewhere in the evening. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, periods of rain or showers. Some heavy falls, possible thunderstorms about Fiordland and southern Westland until early tomorrow morning. For Otago and Southland, high cloud increasing. Rain tonight about Southland, Clutha and the Queenstown Lakes District. Rain at times tomorrow, mainly in the morning and evening. And Chatham Islands, cloudy periods and a few showers. RNZ National, it's 5:07
Kia ora rā, Susana. Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Tonight, details of our first mass vaccination event. Pfizer has confirmed another 1.5 million doses will arrive in New Zealand by the end of August. That's on top of the 1 million being delivered over this month. Starting on July 30th, the Vodafone Event Centre in Manukau will be ground zero for a vaccination blitz for students and staff from the tertiary institution MIT. They're invited to bring whānau too, with the goal of vaccinating 15,000 people over the 3-day event. The government's also announced from August all frontline border workers will be able to opt for a spit test for the virus rather than the more invasive nose swab. But it's also issued the first batch of $300 fines to workers who've repeatedly missed their compulsory COVID tests. Meanwhile, the Australian state of Victoria, where the quarantine-free travel bubble is still operating, has today confirmed 7 new community COVID cases. Joining us now is COVID Response Minister Chris Hipkins. Tēnā koe, e te minita.
Good evening.
So, Victoria, what's your advice to New Zealanders who are there, given there are a number of new cases? Should they come home right now?
We're watching the situation very closely at Victoria. My message to New Zealanders there who are getting a bit worried, I would be thinking, if I was them, I would be thinking, can I withstand a pause? So if there was a pause to be announced, would that be a massive problem for me? If the answer to that question is yes, then I would encourage them to think about coming home to New Zealand sooner rather than later.
So you're pretty much wanting them to pack their bags if they don't have the financial resources to stay longer than they intend?
I'm saying we're monitoring the situation very closely, and a pause is certainly possible. If things get to that point where we're concerned enough to do a pause, then we certainly would do a pause. If people are worried about that, then they should think about coming home.
How possible is a pause? Because at the moment they've got 7 cases. It seems they can't find one of the source people who is still in the community. So how likely is it that you are going to have to put further restrictions on this?
Still waiting to hear the advice from our public health officials. They are on calls with their Australian counterparts at the moment to gather as much information as they possibly can about exactly what's happening there. But based on what I have seen through media reports and others, I am concerned about what's happening there. I am watching it very closely. A pause is certainly possible.
Could you accommodate returning people from Victoria in MIQ if it came to that?
Look, what we've always been pretty clear about is that our first response is to do a pause, and that pause could be for up to several weeks before we would think about other options, including whether there'd be any repatriation of New Zealanders or managed return of New Zealanders. Very, very early days in regards to only a small number of cases there, but based on what we're seeing at the moment, certainly a pause would be the first response if this situation got to a point where we were particularly concerned about it.
Because as you would appreciate, Minister, there is still travel across the border, right? You know, so you had a furniture mover, a house mover going back and forth across the border from New South Wales, obviously, where that got a very severe situation. How far are you from making a call on this?
I would think that we'll get further advice in the next few hours, and we'll keep it under constant review until we either have enough information to say, no, we don't need to do anything, or until we reach a point where we say, no, actually, we do need to do something and we do need to issue a pause.
Let's talk about MIQ, right? Because returnees from New South Wales are putting more pressure on the situation. And just looking forward to spring and Christmas, where you're definitely going to get a rush on of people wanting to come back. What are you forecasting in terms of demand?
Oh, we're already experiencing quite high levels of demand at the moment without the New South Wales people coming into the system. You will have heard me say over the last few months, while MIQ space was available, that it was a good time for New Zealanders who had a need to return home from abroad to do so. We've now kind of reached that point where demand has started to escalate again. We knew that would happen at some point. It certainly happened quite early on relative to where we thought we might get closer towards Christmas before that happened, but it's obviously starting to happen now. So we are looking at all of the different things that we can do to help manage demand to make sure that there's a...
What could you do to increase capacity? Because people want to come back for Christmas, right? That's on the calendar, it's not moving. So what could you do to increase capacity over summer, Christmas period?
Look, the reality here, Lisa, is that we are doing everything that we can to support New Zealanders who are coming home to stay at home. We are not in a position where we can support people to come home for a Christmas holiday.
So you're saying the capacity is what it is and there is no hope of getting any more out of the system?
Look, we do everything that we can to try and make sure we're maximising the use of managed isolation. We have some constraints around maintenance need to be done to some of those facilities, which takes them offline for a period. We tried to do as much of that over the quiet period as we could, but there'll still be need to do some of those things. We do everything we can to make space available. To put it into context, we're doing 3-4 times the amount of managed isolation per capita as Australia are now going to be doing. So we are doing a lot to provide a safe passage for New Zealanders to come home.
You've eased up on cohorting while you're bringing people back from New South Wales. Could you not do that at Christmas? Would you consider it?
Look, I wouldn't rule anything out at this point, but I also wouldn't rule it in. The part of that will depend on what kind of risk profile we're seeing in terms of number of cases coming in across the border.
So how many rooms will be available at Christmas?
Look, at the moment what we're finding is that as fast as we release rooms into the system, they are being snapped up. We haven't released all of the rooms for the latter part of the year yet. And, you know, at the point...
So can you put a number on it, Minister?
Well, we're expecting that the system will be full over Christmas holiday period.
Yeah, but normally you've got capacity for 4,500 a fortnight, right? 500 of that's going to the bubble, another 500 from contingency and 400 that you hold back for other contingencies. Could you not just put it all out there and give the full 4,500 a fortnight over that period of time?
We'll certainly look to maximise the number of rooms that we've got available. We do need to still have some contingency. Otherwise, if you, say, have an evacuation from one of the facilities, for example, you have to have somewhere for people to go. If you have an emergency landing of a flight, you have to have somewhere for those people to go. You can't completely max out the system. The other thing to remember, too, is that the MIQ is based on a 2-week allocation. So, yes, some rooms will be empty for some of the time. That doesn't mean that they're available for the full 2 weeks. So it doesn't mean that someone else could take them. If you've got a room, for example, that's empty for 9 days, actually it has to be empty for 14 days before someone can use it for MIQ.
What can you do then to improve the booking system, right? Because there's a lot of stress here. Are you seriously considering some kind of ballot or a wait list for subgroups as it was described today, or even alerts so that everybody has the same opportunity? For example, the rooms are coming up at 10 o'clock on Tuesday on XYZ date, so you can all be sitting there poised and ready to go.
We're certainly looking at whether there's a way that we can alert people to when rooms are going to be released onto the system so that that's a bit more predictable. Yes, we are looking at that. The challenge is there are a variety of different ways we could run a booking system for MIQ. All of them have got strengths and all of them have got weaknesses. One of the challenges with a waitlist type system is managing particular flights from different locations with room availability in a waitlist system can also be a significant logistical challenge. So every one of the different systems we've looked at has strengths and it's got weaknesses too.
So when can you give a date for when you'll decide whether to give people specifics about room releases? You know, time, date, this is when they're available.
Oh, look, we will try and do that, and the team are working on that. I can't particular date on that, but I hope that will be soon. And I can also give people a reassurance that when we do get into that really peak period over the summer, we will be doing everything we can to release as many rooms as we possibly can.
OK, let's talk about the Viking crew, right? So they're in MIQ in Wellington. Who's paying for that?
The ship will ultimately pay the cost of that, or the shipping company will ultimately pay the cost of that.
Do you think they should be confined to their rooms 24/7, as has been suggested, given that they do have the Delta strain and there are other people in that facility who are not infected with COVID?
Look, I place my trust in the public health officials who run these facilities to make sure that they are absolutely minimising risk. So if they say that people should stay in their rooms, then they should absolutely follow the public health officials' advice. If they say that there is a safe way for them to go and get a little bit of fresh air, then I have confidence that they will do that very safely. But people should ultimately follow the advice of the experts at that facility.
Ngā mihi mō te rā, Minister. That is Chris Hipkins, the COVID Response Minister. Homai o whakaaro, would love your feedback, please. Nō reira anei ngā kaupapa mō te hōtaka nei. Minister says they're keeping a close eye on Victoria. Should people who are over there now, is it their responsibility to bail out while the going is still good? 7 new cases there. Or should we be footing the bill if it's necessary to bring them back on so-called mercy flights and put them into MIQ? Patui mai. Text me, 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is almost 18 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoints on RNZ National. Kia ora rawatu mō te whakarongo mai e haere nei, overloaded nurses heading for burnout with counselling services chocker. Who are they supposed to turn to? A now defunct Auckland company, which received nearly $15 million to house the homeless, now owes the government tens of thousands of dollars in wage subsidies and tax payments. Silver Fern Property Services was placed in liquidation in May after receiving more money than any other emergency housing provider in the country. But documents released to Checkpoint show there was no formal arrangement with the Ministry for Social Development over the accommodation, which some tenants say weren't fit for a dog. Ane te kai repoata, Anita Blake-Person.
Silver Fern Property Services describe themselves as running an Airbnb business, giving shelter to needy families, going above and beyond to look for houses for homeless whānau. And until last June, they did provide accommodation, taking emergency housing payments from the Ministry for Social Development to put people in private rentals in Auckland. But those who stayed there have a very different take on the places they found.
I was on somebody's property, but at the back in that person's sleep out. And Work and Income had paid him $2,800 for this sleep out that he gave us. The sleep out had smashed windows, the front sliding door couldn't lock, the bedding was all damp. They had all the exercise furniture stored in one part of this sleep out.
Rosemary Whariwera and her two boys lived in emergency housing for 2 years, and during that time they were placed in 3 Silver Fern properties. There was the freezing sleep out with its broken windows and damp bedding, then another 2 flats which were next to each other.
There was no locks for the back doors, rubbish dumped on the back doorstep where my car was supposedly had to have gone. Me and my children, my 2 children that were 15 and 13 at the time, were woken up to somebody standing in our kitchen, drugged out, asking for the old tenants. And then when I contacted Silver Fern's property manager, he turned around. All he said to me was, tell them to leave.
Rosemary's experiences are a far cry from the picture painted by Silver Fern Property Services in emails released to Checkpoint, in which the company tries to lobby the government and the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern directly to keep housing the homeless. After MSD stopped using private rentals for emergency accommodation last year, Silver Fern's director Zabina Ndaz wanted to know why her business had been cut off. Her email states, being a proud citizen of New Zealand, I couldn't see our people on the streets or in cars with their children. Silver Fern Property Services was at that time receiving an average of $2,255 a week per client from the government. Social worker Alistair Russell visited several of the places Silver Fern put people in.
Some houses that I considered to be construction sites where there was debris not only out the back of the properties but inside the properties, and that there were houses that didn't have functioning ovens and fridges, and there were gaping gaps in the walls. These places were not suitable for anybody to be living in.
Silver Fern received more money than any other emergency housing provider in the country, but emails released to Checkpoint show there was no contract around that, nor any written agreements around what services would be provided and how. There's no record of MSD doing any checks. They also don't have a list of the addresses Silver Fern supplied. Rosemary Whariwera says no one visited the places she lived at, despite her repeated complaints.
Every time I tried to go somewhere else for emergency housing, Wynne would tell me no. No, that's too much, that's too much, that's too much. No, but we've got Silver Fern's property, $2,800 a week.
Now the company is in liquidation, and landlords and Inland Revenue are among those wanting cash. Even the Ministry for Social Development wants $50,000 of wage subsidies repaid, but it hasn't decided whether it will be taking any legal action. Silver Fern did not respond to Checkpoint's request for comment. Alistair Russell says it's outrageous that much money could be spent with no checks or balances on inappropriate and substandard housing.
Who within the ministry actually thought this was a good idea at the beginning? What is their accountability? That they should be seriously considering their future employment.
The Auditor-General is now investigating MSD's use of private rentals, which saw $38 million handed out between November 2017 and June last year.
It is 23 minutes past 5. Kia mau tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Burnt out nurses are being told to seek help from one another because of high demand for external counselling services. The Nurses Union says the government hasn't told them about any plans to boost nursing numbers, despite constant reports of burnout. Meanwhile, pay talks between the DHBs and some senior doctors and dentists have stalled. Anei te kai Poata and Nick Trubridge.
It's far from a new trend. Burnt out, overworked nurses on the front line who say their mental health is being put at risk. But now it appears the services that are supposed to be supporting staff are starting to flounder, with one nurse telling Checkpoint they and their colleagues have been told to turn to each other for support. Why? Because employee assistance programs are now overloaded too. Kerry Nuku, kai whakahaere of the New Zealand Nurses Organisation, says this is a growing, worrying trend.
The issue with that is that their peers are equally in the same situation, and so there doesn't seem to be an outlet to constructively be able to deal with and work through these problems. It's a significant issue.
But Health Minister Andrew Little appeared none the wiser when quizzed by Checkpoint on issues accessing EAP services.
I haven't heard those reports.
But the Minister insists he is aware of unrelenting staff shortages and constant requests to fill them.
Most DHBs are struggling to have enough nurses to cover the work that is there, and when EDs then get a spike in presentations, that puts even more pressure on nurses. So I'm acutely aware of that.
So what's the government doing about it?
We're working with DHBs and others to make sure that we're doing everything we can to fill the gaps that there are in the nursing workforce.
But Kerry Nuku says she struggles to identify any specific examples or initiatives the government's put in place to boost nurse numbers. She says if there was, nurses wouldn't be pulling out loudhailers and picket signs.
We would not take any action around safe staffing if there were actually government initiatives that were immediately fixing the problem. So it's still a feature across all of the systems. The interviews from nurses have talked about the crisis situation, talked about limited nurses and workforce issues. So they would be hard pushed to say that there are some immediate fixes or initiatives put in place by the government that has had direct and immediate impact.
Nurses are due to strike again later this month, and the discontent doesn't end with them. Senior doctors and dentists, who are members of the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists, today announced they'll hold stop work meetings at every DHB next month to discuss their stalled employment contract negotiations. The association's executive director, Sarah Dalton, says they're seeking modest pay rises to reflect the cost of living increases and inflation, but DHBs continue to come back with a 0% increase.
Public servants, and particularly health public servants, doctors, nurses, their colleagues in allied health, are the ones that have had to step up throughout COVID and still have to step up now in providing health services when we've got massive levels of acute need and significant staffing shortages. We think a cost of living adjustment for senior doctors is the right thing to do and would absolutely be a reasonable thing to do.
And it doesn't end there. Anaesthetic technicians employed at Bowen and Wakefield hospitals in Wellington and Royston Hospital in the Hawke's Bay have today given notice for a 24-hour strike beginning the morning of September 27. They've been in bargaining since May, seeking a 5% pay rise per year. Talks have broken down, however, with Evolution Healthcare offering a 2% pay increase each year for 2 years.
Lockdown just got a little longer in Sydney, 2 weeks longer, but Premier Gladys Berejiklian has signalled it may not end there. There are 97 new cases today and 24 of the infectious people were still moving around the community. While joining us now is Sydney 9 News reporter Charles Croucher. Hi Charles, where is the problem here? Which particular area?
So this started in Bondi in the east, but now the real focus is an area called Fairfield, which is sort of in the west to southwest, plus Canterbury, plus Bankstown. So we're getting to quite large communities now that are really put on notice. And we're seeing tighter restrictions for those areas. And one of the big issues that the officials here are facing is that these are issues with big families that often live in the same house. There are a lot of migrant families, a lot of big households where multiple generations will live in the same house. And what they're finding is that one person will catch the virus and spread it throughout their house within days. And that's happening almost with every case, whereas in previous outbreaks there's been small clusters and one or two people in the house might get it, or half the people in the house might get it. These days it's everyone, and that's causing everyone else in that house could possibly then go and spread it. And because it's multi-generational, you're then getting these transmissions and links that are going to different groups and different community groups, and that's why it's spreading so quickly and has spread so quickly.
The thing is, we watch every day when the Premier gives her update, and every day she seems to be saying this many cases and still this many people still wandering around in the community. So is the message not getting through to stay at home? Are people ignoring it, or do they not quite understand what's expected of them?
I think it'll be a combination of all three. And the other thing that hasn't been clearly spelt out by the government here is what an essential business is. And because of that, there's no one that really knows that they are definitely meant to stay at home or definitely meant to go to work. Well, there's certainly fewer than there should be, and a smaller percentage of the population that know that. So that's what's causing some of the concern. The problem being, of course, you can't simply shut the whole thing down because the economy just can't afford it. So that's the challenge that's facing the state government here and the people here. There are businesses that may not be able to afford to stay open and may not be able to afford to stay closed. And that's a big challenge for them.
Again, your idea of a lockdown is not the same as what we've had in New Zealand. So let's just go on a bit of a virtual walk, Charles, and you can tell me whether these are a yes or no. So if I get up in the morning and go for a wander, can I call into a coffee bar and get a coffee?
You can. It's got to be takeaway, and you've got to check in when you're there. You've got to wear a mask while you're there, but you can get coffee. Thank the Lord. Otherwise,
what if I want to go to IKEA?
Yeah, IKEA is still allowed. It's considered essential somehow. The argument there is that people need furniture if they are moving house or they're moving locations. I think those in charge would say not everyone going to IKEA is going for essential purposes. But again, when you haven't outlined what an essential purpose is, it makes it very hard to know if what you're doing is essential. And then also, it must be impossible for police to enforce consistently when there is no definition. There's no actual law or written out definition of what essential is. So how do you police that is beyond me. But IKEA is allowed.
Yeah, and being at home can be a bit boring. So could I go to the magazine and bookshop and pick up something to read?
Funnily enough, I've just bought 2 books as presents in the last half an hour. You can, however, the rule that's been enforced by the government here is you're not allowed to browse. So you want to go with a pretty good idea of what you want before you get there.
And that is the whole point, isn't it? What counts as browsing?
Of course. That's not defined, and that's the problem as well. Look, the other thing is the government is at all times encouraging click and collect or any kind of online ordering. So I guess the answer the Premier would give would be, you can jump on the online store and grab a book or even get your online IKEA and just go and pick it up. But again, that's really hard and takes a lot of planning, particularly if you're trying to homeschool your kids at the same time as well, like so many people are at the moment in Sydney. So that becomes a big challenge for them. But bookstores are allowed, just no browsing. So, have fun with that.
There's one more that I want you to clarify. What about hairdressers?
Hairdressers, I think, are closed at the moment. And beauty salons are closed. One of the major outbreak points was the Joe Bailey hair salon, which, unbeknownst to me, but is incredibly popular and really go through a lot of customers. So that was one of the initial outbreaks came from that point. And one of the reasons that the government's so concerned about hair salons and beauticians is, of course, these are people from very different groups all coming to the same place for an extended period of time in close proximity. And that seems to be where the virus is spreading. One of the big surprises, I think, of this outbreak has been that there's been no spread outside in an outdoor area. So one of the things the government's kind of hinging its mental health side on is being able to get out and wander around with someone. You can go and meet up with one other person and do exercise. So there are small respites, but as you said, it's not a lockdown like you've been seeing in New Zealand. It's not one like we've seen in the northern beaches of Sydney before or in Melbourne before here in Australia. So the government's putting a lot of faith in the citizens here, and we'll see how well it goes because we've just been, you said, locked in for another 2 weeks until the end of July. And I think if we're being honest, that would be a great result given where we are now.
Okay, because there seems to be some commentary about whether your Premier has let this get away on her, that she didn't go early and hard enough.
Oh, I think that you'd be very hard to find someone who argues that the Premier's handled this well, because there was the opportunity. There was a 10-day period where the cases were bubbling along at 1 and 2 and 3, and with the benefit of hindsight, of course, shutting down then could have stopped this transmission straight away, as other states have done successfully, and territories here in Australia with the Delta strain. What the Premier is arguing is that this Delta strain is a game changer. She said that time and time again over the last 3 weeks, and said that the reason they didn't lock down quickly is they were adopting the same principles they have with other outbreaks here, where they've been able to manage it through contact tracing and through isolating specific people rather than whole groups. I think even the most ardent defenders of Gladys Berejiklian would admit they've called it wrong on this occasion.
Good to talk to you, Charles, and best of luck. That is Charles Croucher, who is a 9 News reporter in Sydney. Kia ora e te iwi e haere nei I a Checkpoint. More details on the mass vax event in South Auckland. Who's invited and how will it work? The first $300 fines are issued to border workers who keep missing their COVID tests. And we've got a cute as a button baby Beaver that was born in the UK. It's the first one born there for 400 years. And we'll also have the latest on the stranded orca. Homai o whakaro. Love to hear from you about anything you've heard on the program this evening. Text us 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or there's always the email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time for the headlines now. Ane a Susanna, mena pita pita kōrero.
Kia ora. The COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins has told Checkpoint a pause in travel to Victoria is possible given the new COVID-19 cases in Melbourne. He says New Zealanders in Victoria who may not be able to sustain an extended stay should consider coming home sooner than intended. Melbourne reported 7 new positive cases today linked to a moving company from Sydney and a family who recently returned from New South Wales. Meanwhile, the New South Wales Premier has extended the Greater Sydney lockdown until the end of the month. The state has recorded another 97 new local cases, 70 of them in Sydney southwest. The government is hoping to vaccinate up to 15,000 people in its first mass vaccination against COVID-19 in South Auckland at the end of the month. Auckland's 3 DHBs are coordinating the 3-day event from Friday, July the 30th at the Vodafone Event Centre in Manukau. It means some Group 4 people will get their vaccine before the national rollout for their age group cohort. Meanwhile, the government has confirmed Pfizer will deliver more than 1.5 million doses of its COVID-19 vaccine next month. COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins says the delivery schedule for August aligns with the ramp-up phase of the rollout. Counselling services at some DHBs are struggling to cope with demand from their burnt-out staff. Nurses say they're being told to talk to their colleagues instead, due to the long waiting times to access employee assistance programs. The Reserve Bank has taken a major step towards future interest rate rises, despite leaving the official cash rate at a record low 0.25%. It's halted its bond buying program, but will keep the cheap money bank lending program. Up to 1,000 Inland Revenue staff have been sent home from their central Wellington office tower after it was found potentially unsafe in an earthquake. Staff will work from home until the 17-storey Asterin building on Featherston Street can be strengthened. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. No mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Kei kone and Nicholas Poynton mena kaupapa kai Pakahi. Nicholas is here to talk all things business. So, RBNZ, what's going on with their tune over monetary policy?
Yeah, well, look, the economists, industry observers, banking industry, we've all been waiting for this moment, how the RBNZ is going to be reacting to some of these more recent inflationary pressures we've been seeing in the economy. The question really is the RBNZ going to maintain its view that these pressures are transitory, or is it going to change its tune and maybe signal a shift in its policy direction? And what we got today in its latest announcement was more of a nod to the latter. In its latest review of policy settings, it says it's going to hold the official cash rate at current levels. That funding funding for lending program, which is essentially cheap loans for banks to then go on and on lend to consumers and businesses. That's been left unchanged, but the key difference here is that its big bond buying program, which is essentially money printing, that's come to a halt. And that's led many economists to now price in an interest rate hike next month. That's because this move is seen as a necessary precursor. And we spoke to ASB's chief economist Nick Tuffley not too long ago. And as you'll hear, he says this announcement wasn't necessarily what the market was expecting.
Yeah, we were a little bit surprised by how explicit the Reserve Bank was that the need to reduce stimulus is basically here now. We'd certainly expected the Reserve Bank to be changing its tone. What it's done is given a fairly clear signal that, barring some surprises, it's likely to lift interest rates at the next meeting in August.
So that was ASB's chief economist Nick Tuffley, who goes on to say that the tipping point for the RBNZ has really been sort of these changes in the shape of the economy since their last statement back in May. You know, our economy, it's grown by 1.6% in the first quarter. Nobody was expecting that. Some of these labour capacity constraints, which we've become all too familiar with, that's creating real inflationary pressures for businesses, as have those supply chain disruptions. And the RBNZ, it has maintained that inflation, remember, it does have a target of about 2%.
Yeah, in the middle.
It expects a spike of about 2.6% in the near term, but it maintained that this was likely to dissipate over the medium term. However, they say today's move was necessary to ensure that it meets those policy targets that it has in the medium term. And the impact that this is going to have some sort of impacts for consumers. First of all, is that term deposit holders, those few who've decided to leave their markets in term deposits, they're going to see slightly more money in terms of their returns, and new borrowers are going to see the price of debt actually increase. And ASB Bank today, they were really quick to move on this. They sort of preempted today's announcement. They have they've broken ranks from the other major banks. They've raised its fixed mortgage rate by between 30 to 36 basis points, notably including 1 to 2 year fixed rates, and those are incredibly popular amongst home buyers. And it's also raised deposit rates by about 15 basis points. Now, other banks are expected to follow suit, but you can probably expect that people who were taking out huge mortgages over the past year, really over-leveraged themselves, we're probably likely to see less of that because the cost of servicing that mortgage is likely to increase. Next piece of info from the RBNZ is out on Friday, and that is the latest read on consumer price inflation numbers.
And what news do you bring from the markets?
Well, the markets reacted negatively to the likelihood that interest rates will come sooner rather than later, down 65 points to 12,720, while the dollar, it got a shot in the arm from today's announcement, up by as much as 1% to about 70 US cents and up to 94 Australian.
Okay, thanks, Nicholas. Nicholas Poynton with business news there. Massey locals have described hiding from gunfire and the horror of a police officer being gunned down in their Auckland suburb. Eli Epiha is on trial at the High Court in Auckland, charged with the attempted murder of police officer David Goldfinch. He's admitted the murder of Constable Matthew Hunt, who died after being fired on in a suburban street in June last year. Katie Todd reports, and just a warning, this story contains some graphic details.
Friday morning, June 19th last year, Jacob Mahia was at home on Rainella Drive when he heard a crash. When he ran down the driveway with his mother's partner, Sam, he says they saw a woman screaming. Next to her was an injured man and a damaged Prius. A black car revved its engine in the middle of the road. He says as a police car pulled up, a man jumped out of the black car holding a gun like an AK-47. Mr Mahia recalls seeing the man's hand on the trigger and then shots.
As soon as I heard those gunshots, I pulled Sam by the back of the shirt and we had gone behind one of the cars to hide.
Pesley Fowey was driving to a fruit shop that morning when he came around a bend on Rainella Drive and saw something he struggled to put into words in the courtroom.
Stopped, I looked left and right, and that's when I saw the shooting happen.
About 10 metres from his car, he remembers seeing a large man with a moustache or a goatee focusing down the barrel of a gun. He also remembers a police officer trying to run or get cover.
Saw the police officer fall to the ground. I sped off. I came to the end of Triangle Road.
Jacob Mahia says as soon as he'd lost sight of the gunman, he and Sam ran inside, closed the curtains, and his mother rang the police. They heard more shots and Sam looked out his bedroom window. He says a woman standing a couple of houses down the road caught his attention. She was waving her arms.
Quite, like a panicked wave, trying to get her, the attention of this guy to follow her.
Mr. Mahia recalled seeing the man with a gun stroll away from the police cars. He described it as the kind of walk someone would do in the mall. The jury has been shown cell phone footage showing a man with a gun appearing to flee the scene in a silver Mazda, driven by a woman with brown hair who the Crown says is Natalie Bracken. In the witness box today, Marcus Tiatia and his partner Aisha Warren Hetherington admitted owning that Mazda. During questioning by prosecutor Brian Dickey, Mr. Tiatia couldn't say how the Mazda came to be in the possession of Ms. Bracken, his brother's ex-partner who'd been staying at his house. But Ms. Warren Hetherington described being threatened by the gunman and Bracken fetching the keys.
He pointed the gun at us and he asked us to take him away.
Marcus Tiatia could remember seeing an injured police officer sheltering behind his own car and running down the back of his property. He described the look on the man's face.
Just looked into his eyes and he looked scared.
Marcus Tiatia says he too was scared.
It is 16 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And Muriaki na Pita Pita Kōrero, after the news at 6, from next month, border workers get to choose between COVID saliva tests or a cotton bud up the nose. A South Auckland tertiary institute is the focus of the government's first mass COVID vaccination event. Starting on July 30, the Vodafone Event Centre will be ground zero for an immunisation blitz for students and staff from the Manukau Institute of Technology. They'll also be able to invite their whānau too. MIT's been chosen because of its high-risk population and because it's close to the airport and border. Maika Sele is MIT's student president. She's hoping a vaccination might mean her and her family can visit home again soon.
I think for a lot of our young people, this is a great opportunity for us to educate our family on the vaccination and also be part of the group and in terms of protecting our community and bringing that opportunity closer to us. So I'll be taking my mum, I'll be taking my cousins and my sister and her family as well. We'll go together, we'll catch the shuttle down to the Vodafone Event Centre, get our jabs, and then we'll go and have a good feed afterwards. Because it is kind of a special moment for us, and it's actually what the vaccination is doing is giving us a bit more freedom to move around and the possibility that we might be able to visit home in Tonga soon.
The goal is to vaccinate up to 15,000 people over the 3-day event. MIT's Professor Martin Carroll says the big push to promote the vaccine to students starts today.
This has been organised through the 3 district health boards in Auckland, so Auckland, Waitemata and Counties Manukau. With the full backing and support of Ministry of Health. We obviously have a close relationship with those district health boards, if only through our nursing programs, but also by virtue of, being in this region. They approached us with the idea that, there's a large Māori and Pacifica population in the communities that we serve and that we are a part of. And so we can work with them to organise large-scale bookings, to try and really reach a large proportion of the population here. So that's the role that we're playing, and we're delighted to work with them. I have to say they have been fantastic to work with.
So when did they approach you?
This has been on the cards for a couple of weeks now. It takes quite a bit, you'll appreciate, to organise the logistics to make something like this happen.
So how many students and staff have you got there? Because the offer extends to them, but also whānau. So how big is your MIT whānau?
So we have 11,000 students and just over 1,100 staff. So there's, just over 12,000 to start with. The reality is, not everyone is going to be able to take advantage of this. But also it's a deliberate part of the strategy to extend it to whānau. We have a more vulnerable population in South Auckland. The statistics show that Māori and Pacifica elderly are more vulnerable to COVID than other populations. So we can use whanaungatanga. We can use our student community and our staff community to get their mums and dads and their aunties and their uncles and their grandparents to come along with them to get vaccinated together. We think that's going to be a really successful strategy.
The Minister is saying that they have capacity for 15,000 vaccinations over that weekend. You've got 11,000 in your core group. Even if they all bring one friend, you're already over that number. So potentially some people might miss out in this event.
Well, this mass vaccination is on top of the rollout to the 4 groups. It's additional to. So there'll already be a lot of people that will have been vaccinated through the normal groups and that still can be vaccinated through the normal groups. And as I say, I don't expect that we'll have a 100% hit rate with getting our students and staff to go along on the weekend that it's been offered. I'm fairly confident that we'll utilise all 15,000.
So what role are you playing in encouraging them?
We're going to be, as of today, as of the Minister's announcement today, promoting this to our students, to their families, to our staff, through all our usual comms, as well as working closely with the Student Council to promote it through the networks that they utilise.
And initially, how have people reacted? And students, that Student Council, are they on board?
They're very on board. They're terrific to work with. They fully understand that for some people this is challenging, a challenging proposition to get vaccinated. And so the idea that we're in this together and that we're working together with families is something that they're very, very keen to support.
Are you aware of any kind of pockets of resistance?
We respect that getting vaccinated is a personal choice, but we do ask that people pay attention to the science. From our point of view, the science is overwhelmingly in favour of getting vaccinated. And look, we're a tertiary education institution, and we know that our students primarily thrive through kanohi ki kanohi, education and training. They like the face-to-face learner experience. The best way we can guarantee that is by having a vaccinated population.
So what's your ultimate goal here? For you, what would success look like?
First of all, I'd like to fully utilise the 15,000 vaccines that are going to be available in that last weekend of July. And ultimately, wouldn't it be terrific if MIT never has to close down again during a heightened alert level because our population is sufficiently vaccinated? That's our goal. This has been organised.
And that was Professor Martin Carroll. Now, people are being encouraged to book in advance for that mass vaccination event. If they meet the criteria, there will be limited capacity for any walk-ups, the COVID minister has warned. The head... actually, let's get to some of your feedback on this one. So, in terms of MIQ, Sarah's got in touch to say the government could significantly ease MIQ congestion if it were to expedite recognition of vaccination certificates from safe countries, as allowing travellers to enter New Zealand without needing MIQ. Where is that piece of work at? Good question, Sarah. And Rick from the Hokianga has got in touch to say, as the Victorian border has been breached in Australia by the removalist who has the Delta strain, New Zealand must completely close the borders with Australia now. Australia has blown it, and if we don't stop New Zealand entry to the self-entitled travellers, so will our country. We will be another Fiji in 2 weeks if we don't. And COVID Response Minister Chris Hipkins is seeking further advice after those 7 new cases in Victoria, because at the moment the bubble is still operating there. Now, the head of MIQ is promising that COVID-positive crew members from the Viking Bay will be kept apart from other returnees. 16 crew members are now isolating at the Grand Mercure Wellington. All but one has tested positive to the highly transmissible Delta variant. Charlotte Cook has the story.
I'm at the Grand Mercure at the top of the terrace, and it is surrounded by houses. There's an apartment complex and a school across the road. The drive-through drop-off area at the front of the hotel is gated off, but at peak times this is a busy, narrow street for both cars and pedestrians making their way through the city. It's here the crew from the Viking Bay fishing vessel are spread between rooms on a separate floor to other returnees who've tested negative and are seeing out their 14 days. Joint Head of MIQ Megan Main says they're using separate lifts, a different exercise, smoking and fresh air area, and staff won't cross over either. She maintains despite not being the normal quarantine hotel, it's up to standard.
All of our facilities treat every arrival as if they have COVID. We've had 152,000 people through MIQ around the country, roughly 1,000 positive cases. This is our job as MIQ to look after these people. We're making sure that we're giving all the support we can to both the returnees and the staff, because this is a reasonable number to have come in at once.
The facility had an extra infection and prevention review this morning to ensure it wasn't missing any gaps. Despite this, not all Wellingtonians are convinced they should have been brought into the city.
No, I'm not happy with that.
Do you think they should be out on the boat?
I would prefer that, yes.
I mean, it's concerning to hear about, but I didn't know anything about it before.
It's okay.
Yeah, you're okay with it? Not concerned?
Well, people have to get treated somewhere, right?
And you feel like the Grand Mercure is up to the task?
They've been doing it already, right? Yeah. No more of a risk than people coming in, like on planes.
I don't come from here, but I'm not very impressed with it, no.
No, I thought they perhaps might have stayed out on the boat in the water. That's frightening, especially when we're getting on in years, so...
Auckland University's Professor of Medicine Des Gorman is on a similar side of the boat. He reckons they shouldn't have been brought on shore at all.
No matter how well your hotels are performing, every time you import the disease, you put the public at risk. And so this is a failure to keep the disease offshore. And by that, I don't mean stopping the ship from berthing in Wellington when it's bouncing around in Port Nicholson. I'm talking about keeping it out of New Zealand waters. So this is a failure of us to execute that plan of actually keeping the disease away from New Zealand until we're vaccinated.
But Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says we have obligations when people are in distress or need medical attention close to New Zealand.
One of the other obligations we've had, particularly for cargo ships, is to allow recrewing. Otherwise, we run the risk of not being able to keep open our supply chain because people aren't able to recrew in New Zealand. That does bring its complexities. It does mean that we do have to provide then facilities and care for those who are not New Zealand citizens.
The Viking Bay needed repairs whilst berthed in Wellington, causing additional complications. Wellington City Council told RNZ the boat needed a diver to repair a valve on the hull which was letting seawater inside. A council spokesperson says the boat was also emptied of all grey water and sewage by a special suck truck, an operator wearing correct PPE.
There have been more reported sightings of orcapods around Wellington today as the search goes on for baby Toa's family. Crews have been scouring from the sea and the air for a fourth day today. Toa, who's believed to be between 4 and 6 months old, was separated from its family over the weekend. Ko taku manuheria nai ko Ian Angus. Ian is DOC's Marine Species Manager. Kia ora, Ian. Hey, these sightings, are any of them Toa's family, do we think?
At the moment, no, we can't confirm that. And we're really appreciating the effort being made by everyone to report these sightings, and certainly the imagery when we get them, location, and also the sense of direction we're seeking. We did try and validate the sightings when we had people in the air, people on the water, and people on the land trying to confirm them, but we didn't find them, and we felt at the time, given the compromised state of the orca that we've got here, we didn't want to try for a relocation effort. So we've bunkered down again for the night, put our efforts into the orca calf to try and keep him stable, look after him over the night, and then we'll start the effort tomorrow morning to look for the pod again.
So how is Toa coping?
Look, we've got an orca that's been heavily compromised, been through a really traumatic experience, but the signs are encouraging. We've certainly seen a little bit more movement. The orca's been responding well to the slight feeding that we've been doing. So a lot of positive signs there, but, still a mountain to climb.
So, Ian, what are you feeding the calf? Because we talked yesterday, it hadn't been fed at that point, just given fluids. So what food is it getting?
It's still fluids, so we're still concentrating heavily on the hydration and rehydrating the orca. That's the key point. But we slowly started to introduce small amounts of liquid feed to it, so vitamins, electrolytes, a little bit of fish oil, some milk, basically just trying to build up its resilience, trying to keep it stable and give us the best chance. So we get that moment when we spot the pod and we think we can make a relocation, that the orca calf is in as good state as we can get it.
How far away could its family be? I mean, realistically, they could be long gone, couldn't they?
They could be anywhere up to Taranaki at the moment. The orca do move quite quickly, and they're constantly moving. That's part of the behaviour. We're hoping that because of the bonds between the mother and the calf, that they may have not moved too far. Also, it might just be that the behaviour brings them back here. So a lot of variables at play here, but we're on the lookout, and we're also hopeful that maybe they'll come back into region.
How long before you need to start making some really tough decisions?
The decisions are really tough at the moment, I'll be honest with you. We're not wanting to be in this situation, having a beautiful but wild animal in an unnatural state. We're just trying to work through methodically. At the centre of our decision making is what's best for the orca. But obviously, the more time the orca's with us being rehabilitated, the more likely there are some risks and implications for it. So we're just working through the scenarios and trying to think almost daily, what's best, what do we do next? How can we try and resolve the situation?
Given that you've said that the family could be as far up the coast as Taranaki, what is the furthest distance that is realistic to move this calf to reunite it?
I couldn't put a figure on that, and I'll explain why just quickly. I mean, obviously, we want to relocate the orca calf when the stress on it will be the least. And so obviously we have to take account how the calf is doing at any moment in time. We have to account for the weather. At the moment, it looks like it's going to be pretty grim for the next few days. And then obviously, how certain are we that we've got the pod and when we move them to an area that they're still there? So there's a lot of variables that we have to take into account. It makes the job terribly difficult, if I'm honest. So I couldn't give you a distance at the moment. There's just too many variables, and we'll take them on the occasion should it present itself, and then work through methodically to assess the risk as we see it.
We're almost out of time, but overnight tonight, will people stay with tour?
Yes, we'll have people, some really hardy volunteers again, watching over, and all they're there to do is just make sure that if the orca starts to deteriorate, we've got some responses what we'll put in place, and just to make sure that it's got some company. Really what we want you to do is just keep an eye over the orca. And the weather's been pretty grim. It's been very cold down here. Some of those volunteers have really stowed some, great spirit.
Thank you so much, Ian, for the update. We really appreciate it. That is Ian Angus from DOC. Now, here's how you can help. They still want sightings of orca pods off the lower North Island's west coast, so between Wellington and Taranaki, so quite a wodge of coast there. If you have a sighting, you can go to wellington@doc.gov.nz, send them an email, or 0800 DOC HOT. 0800 DOC HOT. It's really good if you can get photos, include the specific location of the pod, the direction they are travelling in, and anything that shows their markings is helpful too.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leātaua tēnei. The COVID-19 response minister is concerned about rising cases in Melbourne and says a pause in the travel bubble with the state of Victoria is possible. Melbourne reported 7 new community cases of COVID-19 today. Chris Hipkins told Checkpoint he's waiting on advice from health officials who are currently talking to Australian colleagues. He says New Zealanders in the state need to consider their position.
If I was them, I would be thinking, can I withstand a pause? So if there was a pause to be announced, would that be a massive problem for me? If the answer to that question is yes, then I would encourage them to think about coming home sooner rather than later.
And the lockdown in New South Wales has been extended for 2 weeks, with Greater Sydney reporting about 100 new community cases each day this week. An Auckland resident has described seeing an armed man calmly stroll away from a police shooting outside his house. In the High Court in Auckland, Eli Epiha has admitted murdering Officer Matthew Hunt last June, but denies attempting to murder another officer, David Goldfinch. A witness, Jacob Mahia, recalled seeing a police car pull up near his home on Rainella Drive in Massey and a man jump out of another car with a gun. Mr Mahia says he saw the man shoot at the police, then walk away with the gun held across his body.
Just a casual walk down the street, nothing, not a panic, quick-paced walk. It was more of just a casual stroll, like you do walking around the malls,
Jacob Mahia also described seeing a woman up the road who looked like she was trying to wave down the gunman. A woman who murdered her teenage granddaughter has been given a harsher prison sentence on appeal. Lorraine Smith pleaded guilty to strangling 13-year-old Callis Smith to death at her Whanganui home in 2019. Sarah Robson reports.
At her sentencing, the High Court judge said Smith was suffering carer burnout, looking after her grandchildren and dealing with her own mental health problems. She avoided a term of life imprisonment and was instead jailed for 12 years with a minimum non-parole period of 6 years. But the Court of Appeal quashed that. It said when it looked at the circumstances of Callisa's death and her vulnerability, a life sentence was not manifestly unjust. She must now serve 10 years before she's eligible for parole, the least restrictive sentence the court could impose.
The death toll in South Africa has risen to 72 in violence triggered by the jailing of the former president Jacob Zuma. It includes 10 people killed in a stampede during looting at a shopping centre in Soweto yesterday. Protests that followed Mr Zuma's arrest last week have widened into looting and an outpouring of general anger over the hardship and inequality that persist 27 years after the end of apartheid in South Africa. The military has now been deployed to help the overstretched police. Cuba's government says a man died and many people were injured during a clash between protesters and security forces in the capital Havana. This is the first death confirmed since the mass protests began on Sunday. Here's the BBC's Leonardo Rocha.
The authorities said the man who died was part of a group who attacked a government facility in La Guinera neighborhood on Monday. Witnesses dispute that account of the incident. They say members of the group were brutally attacked by the security forces after joining a spontaneous protest. Cuba's President Miguel Díaz-Canel has blamed mercenary groups supported by the US for the unrest. Dissident groups say more than 100 people have been detained in the past few days, including high-profile journalists and artists.
The wine company Sacred Hill has gone into receivership, owing nearly $100 million. The Hawke's Bay-based company, which also has vineyards in Marlborough, has a significant amount of debt with the bank. In 2019, the company overstated the amount the stock it had. Other factors in its failure include a poor 2021 vintage, the high US dollar exchange rate, and poor financial performance. The Canterbury Regional Council supports making more man-made islands in Canterbury's braided rivers, but says extreme care is needed. The head of the group, Braided River Aid, is calling for more islands to be built within the rivers to provide more bird habitat. The Regional Council's river manager, Lee Griffiths, says it supports the idea of creating bird islands, but it has to get past some misconceptions.
There's a perception that large machines in rivers are a bad thing. They have their place if it's done correctly. The key thing is careful management, careful planning, careful consultation before anything happens to ensure it's done in the right way.
Lee Griffiths says the council has created bird islands in braided rivers in the past. It's coming up to 5 minutes past 6. The Silver Ferns coach Dame Nolene Taurua is pleased to be back competing in home and away netball games. The Silver Ferns have locked in a 4-test Constellation Cup series against the Australia Diamonds in October to be split between the two countries. COVID-19 travel restrictions cancelled last year's series and Dame Nolene is looking forward to the games.
We've been hanging out to actually secure those dates and lock them into the planner, which makes everything else easier to manage.
A Silver Fern squad to prepare for the Constellation Cup defence will be named next month. Injury has forced show jumper Sean Wordley and his horse to withdraw from the New Zealand team for the Tokyo Olympics. The travelling reserve Uma O'Neill comes into the team alongside Bruce Goodwin and Daniel Meach. New Zealand golfer Danny Lee's hopes of retaining his US Tour card have suffered a major setback, with Lee having fractured a rib. He pulled out after the first round of last week's PGA Tour event in Illinois. He currently sits 178th in the Tour rankings, needing to finish in the top 125 with just 5 weeks of the season remaining. The Queensland coach Paul Green is fighting for his coaching future, and another loss to New South Wales on the Gold Coast tonight could spell the end of his stint in charge of the Maroons, who trail 2-0 in the State of Origin series. That's the news.
It's been pretty intense. So during the sort of hard parts of the season, it's
10 times a week in the pool.
This week on Champions of the Pacific, we profile our Pacific Olympians heading to Tokyo. Check us out at rnz.co.nz under the Pacific tab, or download us wherever you get your podcasts. Or listen in to Champions of the Pacific Wednesday nights at 9:40 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Waikato, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty, also Gisborne and Hawke's Bay. Mainly fine, the odd shower near the west coast. Waitomo to Kapiti, including central high country. Cloudy periods, a few showers developing tonight. Wairarapa, Wellington, Marlborough and Nelson, fine tonight. Scattered rain developing tomorrow afternoon or evening. For Canterbury, fine tonight. Rain about the Alps tomorrow. Scattered falls elsewhere in the evening. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, periods of rain or showers, some heavy falls, possible thunderstorms about Fiordland and southern Westland until early tomorrow morning. Otago and Southland, high cloud increasing, rain this evening about Southland, Clutha and the Queenstown Lakes district. Rain at times tomorrow, mainly in the morning and evening. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods and a few showers. RNZ National, it's 7.5 minutes past 6.
Nā mihi mo te rā e hoa, no mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. The government's hoping to vaccinate more than 15,000 people in its first major mass vaccination blitz later this month. The 3-day event in South Auckland will target staff, students and their families from the Manukau Institute of Technology. At the same time, Pfizer has confirmed it will deliver 1.5 million doses of the vaccine next month, the biggest shipment yet. Here's our political reporter Katie Scotcher.
Manukau, get ready to rock up and roll up your sleeves.
Today I can confirm that the first mass vaccination event will be held at the Vodafone Event Centre in Manukau from Friday the 30th of July through to Sunday the 1st of August.
It's hoped more than 15,000 people will be vaccinated at the event, which is being managed by Auckland's 3 district health boards. COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins says staff and students from the Manukau Institute of Technology, as well as their families, will be invited.
Inviting people from the MIT community to get vaccinated at this first event does mean that some of the people who are in Group 4 will be getting access to vaccination slightly ahead of the rollout for their age cohort. We're asking these people for their help in encouraging older and more at-risk members of their whānau to get the vaccine so that their community can be more protected from COVID-19.
The Minister says hundreds of staff will be on deck for the 3-day event.
To vaccinate 5,000 people in a day, it will require a lot of people because it's not just the vaccinators. You've then got to have the people who are signing them in, the people who are marshalling the car park and doing all those other things.
Another big event will be held in the same spot 6 weeks later, so people can get their second dose of the vaccine.
We've got sufficient vaccine stock to run this particular event without that having to disrupt the wider rollout plan or without having to in any way reduce the allocation to district health boards.
This is thanks to confirmation of Pfizer's August shipment schedule.
Pfizer will deliver more than 1.5 million doses of the vaccine into New Zealand during next month. That represents our biggest monthly delivery to date.
It comes off the back of the delivery of 1 million doses expected from Pfizer this month, which Chris Hipkins says are on track. And as of midnight last night, more than 1.4 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine had been administered in New Zealand. Meanwhile, border workers will soon be able to choose regular saliva testing instead of the more invasive nasal swab.
We'll start with those on the 7-day testing cycle, and we're aiming to roll it out to them by mid-August, and it'll be expanded over several months to include the rest of the estimated 13,000 people who are required to be tested on either a weekly or a fortnightly basis.
The Ministry of Health has long been reluctant to swap nasal swabs with saliva testing, but Chris Hipkins says officials are now happy for it to be used for surveillance testing.
Their advice continues to be that for diagnostic purposes, i.e. if someone's got symptoms, that it's still best to use the nasal pharyngeal swab just to be absolutely assured that we're getting the best possible testing for them.
The ACT Party's Deputy Leader, Brooke Van Velden, says this should have happened much sooner.
We've had months of pilots and border workers and New Zealanders enduring swabs being shoved up their nose when it wasn't ever necessary. There was this alternative for saliva testing all along. I don't think it's acceptable that we have been using old technology when new technology is there and it's ready to be used.
Chris Hipkins also today revealed 16 infringement notices and fines have been issued to border workers who haven't complied with testing requirements. He says they were given testing opportunities, reminders and formal warnings before they were served. Mr Hipkins says the workers are private employees that remain in their jobs but do not work in managed isolation facilities.
Sydney siders will be locked down for at least another 2 weeks as the number of new COVID-19 cases in the community remains high. Several younger people are among those in intensive care after contracting the coronavirus. Here's our World Watch reporter Sally Round.
People in Sydney are being urged to stay home with the daily count of new cases continuing to hover around the 100 mark. The Greater Sydney area is in the third week of lockdown as it remains in the grip of the Delta variant of the virus. New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian says the numbers are still too high.
And it always hurts to say this, but we need to extend the lockdown at least a further 2 weeks, from Friday the 16th of July to Friday the 30th.
Queues for COVID-19 tests in one of the hotspots in Sydney's southwest stretched for kilometres overnight. This was due to new health orders requiring people who leave the suburb for work to be tested regularly. The Premier praised the 65,000 people who've been tested in the last 24 hours.
That is an outstanding number. And we deeply, deeply appreciate the number of people that did that. And we need those rates to stay consistently high so that we're confident we have captured all chains of what we call community transmission.
But Ms Berejiklian warned people to stick to the rules, as about a quarter of today's new cases were infectious in the community. 2 people have died so far and 71 are in hospital. The state's Chief Health Officer, Kerry Chand, says all age groups are at risk. Of the 21 people in intensive care, 5 are under the age of 40.
Yes, it is less likely to lead to hospitalisation and death in younger age groups, but it still can be a serious illness requiring admission to ICU.
In the neighbouring state of Victoria, 2,000 people who attended an AFL game at the MCG on Saturday are being told to isolate and get tested after a positive case also attended the game. Victoria's recorded its biggest daily increase in weeks, 7 new cases linked to people who'd recently returned from New South Wales. Meanwhile, support groups have welcomed a new $17 million package to address the impact of the lockdowns on mental health. John Brogden of Lifeline Australia says it's much needed.
What we're seeing at the moment is our calls going back up again towards the average they were in 2020 in the middle of COVID. So we've seen quite a quick increase in calls as a response, particularly of the Sydney lockdown.
Sydney's lockdown has been extended until at least midnight on the 30th of July.
Returning to our earlier story about nurses feeling burnt out and struggling to access support services, we've had a message from Jordan from the organisation RAISE, who says they provide support to a number of DHBs across the North Island. He says he was gutted to hear that nurses have been told there is no capacity for support. He says they're here to help and would encourage anyone needing support to get in touch at 0800 735 343. That number again, 0800 735 343. Or you can get in contact at raisementalhealth.co.nz. raisementalhealth.co.nz. And we'll put those details on our website. It is 6:15 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. More reported sightings of orca pods have search crews in the Wellington region scouring the water from the air. They're into their 4th day of searching for the family of Tor, the baby orca, who was separated from his pod over the weekend. And our reporter, Kirsty Frame, spent the day with volunteers caring for the orca.
The dock outside the Plimerton Boating Club looks vastly different today, with a campsite of camper vans, gazebos and industrial heaters set up near the orca's enclosure. Almost all the gear has been donated by the local community, and particularly since Monday, a sea of kai has been donated to keep the crew energised. Theo Sartorius, a local volunteer firefighter helping the rescue, has been blown away.
Oh yes, it's been amazing. Every probably 5 minutes we had someone turn up there, big crates of food, so many scones, towels, blankets. It's amazing. It's just we've got a full trailer here.
Last night, again, the temperatures along the exposed coast went below freezing, but the extra supplies made a big difference. It didn't stop today either, with Billy Fitzpatrick sending down his camper van for the crew to set up in.
I just took the day off work again. Being the boss, that's quite good. And I brought the camper van down to park up and plug in and give them a heater and hot drinks and stuff. So, yeah, just do what we can to help.
The search for Toa's family has developed extensively outside the harbour, with lookout stations set up with volunteers. Shane Coulston, a builder who's been volunteering, put out a call for spotters and had close to 100 people come through.
We've been rolling a rotation through there, and in the meantime other people get in contact and, well, that place is full, so why don't you go here or why don't you go there, or you're on the south coast, stay out there, keep an eye out there, because just anyone seeing any orca anywhere is going to be helpful to us.
The Plymouton Boat Club has kept its doors open at all hours so volunteers can have sheltered meetings and hot showers. Some locals have also opened up their homes for crew who live further away to spend the night. Gail Carmichael from the Boat Club isn't at all surprised by the generous acts.
The community's been fantastic, but Plymouton community is. They're always like this with anything. And yeah, they've just come out to help.
Back outside, Toa spends his day swimming around his enclosure and interacting with the crew in the water. The volunteers braving the winter water operate on hourly rotations, and there's no shortage of people ready to get in. Emily Borbett from the Whale Rescue says little Toa has perked up a lot and even drank some goat's milk today.
I don't think he cries at all during the day, and then you can tell when he's wanting to calm down and sleep. He kind of nuzzles up to you. If you're in the water, he kind of comes up and he wants you to hold him.
Toa's set to spend another night in Plymouton with the support of a community behind him.
And just a reminder of how you can help with this. The doc is still looking for sightings, right, of orcapods. So the area they're concentrating on is between Wellington and Taranaki. So it's quite a long line of the coast there, along the west coast. If you see anything, you can call 0800 DOC HOT, 0800 DOC HOT, or the email address is wellington@doc.gov.nz. Now, essential information that they need is the location of the pod, check what direction the animals are travelling in, and if you can get photographs or video, that's super helpful. And what they're specifically wanting to see is the saddleback or the markings of the animals and their dorsal fins, because they're wanting to determine whether this is actually the whānau of Toa or just another pod. So as much information as you can gather is really helpful, and flick it onto Doc as soon as you can get it. If you're just joining us, also, we were talking to the COVID Recovery Minister, Response Minister earlier in the programme. And this is about new cases in Victoria, right? New South Wales is under a lockdown, and Victoria, though, we are still open for travel backwards and forwards. So the Minister is warning that there are a growing number of locations of interest that are of concern in Victoria. And he says public health officials are currently reviewing the situation there and will provide advice to him in due course. In the meantime, and this is from the Minister, I want to encourage anyone with concerns about the potential of a pause to quarantine-free travel to organise to get home as soon as possible. So that warning from Chris Hipkins, if you can't afford to stay on if there is a pause, then you probably need to get your skates on and get home as soon as possible. He's saying if you're worried about the potential of a pause, organise to get home as soon as possible. And a reminder, people coming back need a negative pre-departure test within 72 hours of departure, 72 hours of departure. And you have to complete a health declaration confirming that you haven't been in a location of interest. But that warning from the COVID Response Minister, Chris Hipkins. The British Prime Minister has hauled in the big tech companies to demand they do more to stamp out racism on social media. It comes as police investigate a string of offensive and racist social media posts directed at 3 players after England lost to Italy in the Euro final on the weekend. There are calls for the social media giants to release the details of the offenders so they can be named, shamed and prosecuted. The ABC's Samantha Hawley reports.
At a mural of England football star Marcus Rashford, they came to leave messages of support. His image repaired after vandals took to it after Sunday's Euro loss for England. Marcus Rashford and fellow players Jadon Sancho and Bukayo Saka missed their penalty shots in England's match against Italy and were bombarded by racist posts on social media. There were at least 2,000 abusive tweets.
The moment that I saw that 3 young black England players had missed their penalties, I knew what was coming next.
Chine MacDonald is a journalist and author of God is Not a White Man.
It was a racist backlash because that's the nature of sport, and that seems to be the nature of social media and support in the UK.
She's among those calling for the social media giants to release the details of the offenders.
I think absolutely we need to name and shame those who feel that it's appropriate and that they can get away with using horrific language, being hateful, being racist to people, to anyone, let alone people who have got your nation, your country, to the final of a major men's tournament.
Boris Johnson has summoned representatives from the big tech companies to demand more is done to counter racism on social media. But his government is under pressure too, with his Home Secretary, Priti Patel, referring to players taking the knee as gesture politics. Dr Halima Begum from the race equality think tank the Runnymede Trust says the British leader also needs to do more.
Now, that is about taking a stance and a position and signalling to the rest of society that there's no place for racism in football or wider society.
Upset, appalled. What more do we have to do?
Paul Canaville was the Chelsea Football Club's first black player. He says the tech companies need to do more to stop the racism online, and the offenders need to be brought to justice.
This has happened far too long, and the social media need to get on top of it.
Larissa Kennedy is the head of the National Union of Students.
I think, safety, digital safety of black and brown folks in particular is something we really need to take a long, hard look at.
Police are investigating the racist abuse.
British police have now arrested a man after a racist tweet was sent to English forward Marcus Rashford. He's now being held on suspicion of inciting racial hatred. To China now, where a father's been reunited with his kidnapped son 24 years after he was snatched by human traffickers. Guo Zhangqiang spent the time travelling hundreds of thousands of kilometres in search of his boy. His quest inspired a movie and helped to locate many other missing children, but never his own, until now. The BBC's Stephen MacDonald takes up the story.
For decades, Guo Gangtang travelled from town to town on a motorbike, with large banners fluttering off the back showing photos of his missing son. The 2-year-old was snatched from outside the family home in Shandong province in 1997. Guo Gangtang never gave up looking for him. The father's relentless search for the boy inspired a film adaptation of the story, and he used the fame which followed to help other parents find their missing children. But his own son remained unaccounted for. Until now. This was the moment Guo Xinzhen, now a 26-year-old teacher, walked into a room to meet the parents who'd not seen him for more than 2 decades. His mother burst into tears. His father could barely speak as he hugged him. The Chinese police who organised the reunion found their missing son using a DNA match. They say 2 suspects, a man and a woman, have already been arrested on suspicion of abducting Guo Xinzhen and selling him. Tong Bishan from the National Bureau of Crime Investigation spoke to reporters.
As the father of an abducted child, throughout 24 years searching for his son, despite carrying the pain of missing a child, Guo Guangdong remained rational, calm, tenacious and optimistic. He did volunteering work, combating human trafficking, reporting clues to the police. With his help, police found more than 100 abducted children.
This year, the police here have launched a major blood testing drive in the hope that DNA matching might result in a breakthrough for many unsolved cases. The authorities say that nearly 10,000 people have come forward to be tested, and that since January this has led to 2,609 people being found, one of whom had been missing for 61 years. The police also say they've arrested 372 suspects who are accused of abducting children. However, the scale of the problem has been so enormous in China that tens of thousands of missing children remain unaccounted for.
Now here, kōrero nā hau tēnei. This one is an interesting one. For the first time in 400 years, a baby beaver's been born on Exmoor, a national park in the UK. The species is being reintroduced to the country after being hunted into extinction. And as Lydia Batham reports, this cute baby beaver's got a role to play in the fight against climate change.
Taking a dip with mum, a 6-week-old baby beaver caught on camera. They're on their way back to the family lodge, but stop swimming to have a nibble on a branch. Centuries ago, this would have been a common sight in the British countryside, but it's one that's been missing after beavers were hunted to extinction during the 16th century. So 18 months ago, 2 Eurasian beavers were released on the National Trust's Honeycutt estate. Now 2's become 3. Ranger Jack Siviter had an inkling a baby beaver, known as a kit, was imminent, as the male was building and dragging wood around in late spring, whilst the mother was staying out of sight. He's particularly proud of the mum, who's called Grills because of her survival instincts, as she was orphaned young, but seems to have taken to parenthood well. They'll live as a family for the next 2 years, before the kit heads off to new territories. But these busy beavers have beavered away in more way than one. As a keystone species, their presence is good for nature and the area they live in, and they've been no exception. They've been creating a dam complex made from trees, mud, stones and vegetation that slowed the flow of water and created ponds on the estate. In the long term, this will reduce the impact of floods and droughts expected with climate change. It's also led to a more diverse habitat, with bats, dragonflies, herons, kingfishers and otters regularly visiting the site. So this new addition is likely to make a bigger difference than just being the first in centuries.
So cute and super clever too. More of your feedback on MIQ. This one is from Louise. It drives me crazy, this expectation people have to travel back and forth. Get used to it. There is a global pandemic, for goodness sake. I grew up in the UK in the 1960s and managed to meet my New Zealand grandparents twice over the years. If you live overseas, not being able to visit easily will be the new normal, perhaps. A lot better for the environment too. My feedback for what it's worth, says Louise. On the Aussie bubble, this person says, I think that the government is far too accommodating to the people who choose to go to New South Wales after being warned that the bubble could close and now complain that they are having trouble coming home. The rest of us should not have to pay for their stupidity, says Tim of Coromandel. And this from another listener, Melbourne returnees in MIQ, because remembering there are some new cases today, 7 of them in Victoria. They say those returning from family reunification visits should receive government-paid MIQ. Those returning from work-related visits or holidays should pay their own way. And Tony is of the opinion, don't worry about coming back from Victoria. This kind government will fund your MIQ. On the Viking crew, our government is putting New Zealand workers, the backbone of New Zealand and our tax system, at risk through allowing the mariners onto New Zealand soil. The government seems more interested in their international goodwill, says that listener. That's about all we've got time for. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō on First Up from 5 a.m. tomorrow. Deputy Prime Minister Grant Robertson on the government's call for Kiwis in Melbourne to come home.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins says a pause in the travel bubble with Victoria is possible, given Melbourne's 7 new local cases. New South Wales has extended its lockdown for 2 weeks after Greater Sydney recorded about 100 new community cases every day this week. The government is hoping to vaccinate up to 15,000 people in Manukau in its first mass vaccination event at the end of July. The search is continuing for an orca pod to reunite with a stranded calf north of Wellington after 2 unconfirmed sightings in Kapiti and Taranaki today. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
The vaccine is very good at protecting you from serious illness and death.
but it's not quite as good at stopping you from being infected.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
Those birds have gone crazy. They've done really well in that Bushy Park area, so Turitea was this great nearby spot that we could bring back some birds.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Kia ora, Karen, and I'm Brian Crump, getting ready for another night on RNZ National, and my first guest out in the news at 7 is the sports writer Ron Polanski. He's written a new book about 100 years of rivalry